problem is the problem is, number one, he's trying to use that to reinterpret the Bible, and number two, pretty much every astronomer in Europe agrees with what the church is saying, that your science is wrong. And then the third problem that comes out is that Galileo's proof for the rotation of the Earth is the tides, and that's not true. The tides do not result from the rotation of the Earth. The tides are the result of the position of the moon, and that, by the way, isn't known for another 100 years or so. But so it turns out that this stuff is actually a lot more complicated than we're led to believe.
Oh, it really is, isn't it? And it makes sense. It would be much more complicated because we're dealing with people. All of the stuff, all of the politics that goes around that, we share.
Yeah,
And I think that what we're sold, it was quite white. It was this or that, and it was a clear choice. And so,
yes. So, and there's a really interesting reason for that. And by the way, I will take this opportunity to recommend a book because it's fascinating, and probably have the author, who's now passed away, was a mentor of mine at University of Wisconsin. His name was Ron Numbers, and it was Galileo Goes to Jail and Other Myths About Science and Religion. If you want to get it, I think you can get it on Kindle, so it's like $5 US at this point. That book's been out for a long time. But what the book does is it goes through some of the pretty commonly held conceptions in the history of science and says, okay, here's what's been commonly told, and here's what actually happened, or here's what we can determine happened to the best of our knowledge. Now, just to get back to why this happens in the first place, and I'm sure this will not play as a shock to you, in the late 19th century, the U.S. has really, from like 1840 to like 1880-ish, the U.S. has a wave of Catholic immigration, predominantly Irish, Italian, in some cases Spanish, so on and so forth. And the U.S. up until this point is effectively a Protestant country. I mean, whether or not we have an official state religion, which we sort of do up until this point, it's mainline Protestantism. And obviously, reactionaries get concerned about this and start saying these immigrants are going to take their orders and owe their loyalty not to the U.S., but to the Pope. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? So there's a series of books. One comes out by someone named Andrew Dixon White, who is I believe the first president of Cornell University. And there's one other, John William Draper, who's actually a chemist, writes a book called The History of the Warfare Between Science and Religion. And what these books do is using Christianity primarily as a stand-in for, or using rather Roman Catholicism as a stand-in for religion, they argue that religion and science have always been in conflict, and it will only end when science inevitably triumphs and destroys religion. And that was the dominant thought in history of science, the relationship between science and religion, up until really the 60s. There's a few things that changed in the 60s. One is that people start re-examining Galileo, and history of science as a discipline really starts in the 40s and 50s and the 60s. It's really a creature of the post-Cold War, right? So we are behind the communists. We have to bolster interest in science. And this is actually how a lot of really terrible information about lifting weights comes into the U.S. as well, but that's neither here nor there. And what happens is that a lot of the early historians of science do some very interesting work examining some of these key incidents or these key flashpoints that are told in the conflict thesis, and doing things like developing critical editions of texts, which is actually very interesting work. It's very, very hard, but they don't. This is stuff the field doesn't do anymore. This is also why I kind of dropped out of the field. But as a result, and due to the efforts, actually primarily of a pair of agnostics, Dave Lindbergh and Ron Numbers, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the field begins to understand that the story that everyone believes is actually a lot more complex than everyone thinks.